Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for attending this seminar on the debt strategy and the strategy to mobilize domestic resources. The mobilization of domestic resources has become a priority for the last few years. In Addis Ababa, during the conference held on the financing of development, there was some awareness that the mobilization of domestic resources was a key element for the financing of the SDGs, and this has increased over the last few years. Why? Well, because you have this famous impossibility of billions and trillions, and we realized that the funding of SDGs and the financing of global resources, such as climate change, required considerable amounts of money, and that these financing needs could not be covered by the usual sources, financing sources for the development. And therefore, the mobilization of domestic resources has become not a priority, but the priority. Two elements just to show that this awareness has turned into a priority. The first one is the French program to support the mobilization of domestic resources, with about 130 billion euros over a period of 6 years to support the technical mobilization capacities for public domestic resources, mainly tax resources. So it's really a priority for French support. And this seminar is organized in the frame of this program and this platform, this MRIP platform, which Ferdi participates to. And the second element showing that this awareness has become a priority is the recent joint initiative of the IMF and the World Bank on the mobilization of domestic resources. And when you look more closely at the document, and I invite our listeners to refer to this document, so that regarding the presentation of this initiative, we can see that one of the three pillars for the mobilization of domestic resources is the development of the public debt markets, such as, and particularly those in local currencies, dealing with local savings. So we talk about the mobilization of local savings, and also to facilitate the management of debt. And we can see that there are obvious links between the sustainable indebtedness and the management of the debt and the medium-term strategies to mobilize domestic resources. We talked about the development of public markets in local currencies, and it is probably the most important interaction between these two strategies, debt strategy and the mobilization of domestic resources. But there are also others, obviously. The capacity to mobilize tax resources is a major factor, and it's even, I would say, a key factor to have access to the markets, whether they be international markets or domestic markets. And it is a major element used by the rating agencies, which is also a key factor when it comes to access to the markets. The second interaction between these strategies is that when there is an exogenous shock on the debt market, which was the case with the increase of interest rates, the US interest rates, which itself was due to the rising inflation, global inflation. So the capacity to mobilize more domestic resources and internal resources, either in the form of tax revenues or the mobilization of domestic savings, which can be key to diminish the cash problems when the international markets are closed or almost closed, and when there is a tightening of the domestic markets, and this also allows to face these cash and liquidities problems without having an impact on future expenses, which are of course key for development, nor the social expenditures, which are key for political stability. Another interaction, and then I will stop because I don't want to take too much time. Another interaction between these two strategies is the symmetrical interaction. In other words, when there is a strategy, an indebtedness strategy with limits and vulnerability to exogenous shocks, such as, for instance, longer maturities for borrowings on international markets or domestic markets, with contingency clauses in case of climate catastrophes. This improves the feasibility of the strategy, the domestic resources mobilization strategy in the medium term, to allow us to face these indebtedness shocks. I'm not going to go any further in the description of this project, because we have around this virtual table an important group of experts with different points of views, but complementary points of views. We have IMF experts, the WAEMU expert, French experts from the Club de Paris, and an expert from the CEMAC region with the director of the Congolese Caisse d'Amortissement. I would like right away to give the floor to the IMF and to Mr. Dodo Jonansson, who is the Deputy Chief of the Capital Markets within the monetary markets and the capital markets of the IMF.
Mr. Jonansson, the floor is yours. And again, thank you very much to be around this virtual table.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to be here, and thank you for shining the light on this topic, and thank you for referring to the new initiative. And it's particularly interesting to be joining these different, not too different, but these disciplines of fiscal policy and debt management and markets. And I think we have a very good opportunity to really try to connect the dots. And I prepared a few slides that will be then followed by my colleague Catherine Bayer from the Fiscal Affairs Department. But if allow me to, well, my button is not working, so I need to rely on Fabienne for the slides, please. Thank you very much. So if you can go to the next slide. And apologies for not making the presentation in French. Unfortunately, my French lessons, they stopped during the pandemic, and I have not been able to recover since. But if you can put it into presentation mode, please. Thank you. So so basically, just to be sure that we are talking about the same things, like of course fiscal policy. Think about the fiscal policy as the blueprint for the macroeconomic stability, striving for equity, efficiency, and sustainable growth. And then the main outcome of that is, of course, the achieving the primary balance through strategic spending and taxation, and that we know. The other discipline is the debt management, and think about the debt management as the safety net. It's ensuring that financing needs are met at the lowest cost and effectively managing risks. And the manifestation of the outcome of debt management is usually through some strategic benchmarks that really portray what is the composition of the debt. If we can go to the next slide, please. And then, as you mentioned, Bruno, like the policy interdependencies are there, and that's why it makes sense to be looking at these things jointly. And if we dive a little bit into these two realms and how they influence each other, it's of course that that structure is going to directly impact the fiscal cost and the sustainability. And then on the other hand, we have the tax and the expenditure levels that really dictate the volume of debt issuance. And as we know, mistakes in debt management can lead to increased debt servicing costs, and poor fiscal policies can raise market risks and the cost of debt servicing. And so understanding these links and having these two realms communicating effectively is really key, as I will come to. If I can go to the next slide, please. So basically, what I like to think about the future debt profile, it's really the crystal ball for the fiscal policy, and the things to consider is really the debt servicing. What part of the revenue is going to be available for debt servicing? And remember that if the revenue is being used for debt servicing, it cannot be used to fund any other expenditure. So these are really the trade-offs imposed by debt management. And then there is the vulnerability. Of course, are we facing higher debt risks due to the current structure of the debt? Is the debt sustainable in terms of when you look further into the future, the R minus and then the composition matters, like short-term foreign currency, domestic currency, floating interest rates, fixed interest rates, and these all like relate to the stability of the debt servicing costs that is going to most surely affect the fiscal outcomes. And then an area that's often overlooked is the investor base, having some idea what is the resiliency of the investor base, and there the local currency bond market is really important because that can often act as a safety net. So thinking about what types of holders you have, especially on the private external debt. How stable are these holders? Are they committed? Are you established as a borrower? Are you in the process of establishing a good track record? And that's really the foundation. Next slide, please. And the foundation is, of course, the fiscal policy. It's basically the bedrock of debt management and provides the credibility. And there you have the revenue and the expenditure dynamics key to really provide us the basis for any analysis that you do on the debt management. And then there is the sort of the joint link with the investor confidence. And the more confidence and credibility, the lower the credit risk, the lower the interest rate. And then really, how can revenue dynamics and the composition of the revenues can really also provide important information to determine what is the composition of the public debt. So if you have revenues in foreign currency, that almost implies that you can borrow more in foreign currency. What is the timing, stability? These are all factors that should be present when you're doing the debt management analysis. And then, of course, you need to determine like the overall fiscal space. What is the outlook? Is it a sunny or a cloudy outlook? And then that fiscal space is going to determine how much debt you can actually carry, and also needs to factor into both the medium and the longer term expectations for the debt carrying capacity. Next slide, please. So that really takes me a little bit into what is the medium-term debt management strategy. I guess overall, like there has been a lot of effort by the IMF and the World Bank to support the capacity development of the debt management strategy, particularly over the last 10 years. And if I just give you an example of approximately looking across like 85 low-income countries, at the beginning, very few were producing debt management strategies. At the present moment, roughly half is able to prepare their own debt management strategy, sometimes with a little bit of support. So why is it important? It's basically articulating the debt management objective. It's taking the debt management objective of minimizing cost according to risk and operationalizing it. And at the same time, it's really a communication effort where you have the main stakeholders both within the government, give it central bank, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Finance. They gather around, they agree on this is the plan, and then that plan is implemented by the debt management unit, which is not always easy, because in many developing economies, the debt management office that we know in advanced economies is fragmented across several different entities, both internally and often across more than one ministry. So this really ties together all these efforts into one, and provides for a system of accountability. And of course, having a debt management strategy allows the government or the debt management unit to really communicate what is the intention when it comes to debt issuance in the future. Next slide, please. So this very busy slide is talking a little bit about the interplay, how these things come together. Is putting in a graphic what I explained earlier, the revenue, the expenditure, the borrowing requirement, and this can be an interactive analysis when you're doing the preparing the strategy, because there may be limitations coming from the borrowing side that can affect the fiscal policy. In the case of developing economies, this is often the availability of longer-term financing from concessional sources that will require careful planning, and may sort of during the planning stage sort of affect the fiscal policy and the fiscal policy stand, because if you're running deficits or have investment needs that you're unable to finance, that creates a binding constraint, right? And all of that sort of feeds into the desired debt composition that needs to be very much agreed. So sometimes I look at the debt management strategy as a not only from the perspective of the strategy, but also from the perspective that this is a way to get agreement among all these different stakeholders and make sure that we're all on the same page. Next slide, please. And then another way to look at it, and because I find it's often easy to talk about these things as a concept. We need to coordinate the revenue mobilization and debt management and development of markets. But how really do we communicate? And it's sometimes useful to think about the interaction in terms of units of account that we all know and all agree on, and we have different frameworks to really instigate the planning and the preparation. And really, I find it useful to think about it like one in a medium-term perspective, which is the upper half of that chart. Really, the fiscal objectives, that sustainability analysis, you're putting the things and you're looking at a medium-term period. And then also it becomes super important to think of the implementation within the fiscal year, where, as we know, our plans, they may have to change. There are unexpected developments, and in recent years, those have been, more significant with the pandemic and with the geopolitical developments and political developments in individual countries. So you need to really be able to communicate with these different entities, budget entities, and to make sure that the decisions are sort of well-informed, well-established, transparent, and you can actually maneuver like different cash cycles within the year, unexpected borrowing, etc. So we all know that. But it's super important and super challenging, actually, because these connections may not have been very active. Next slide, please. So this really goes into the challenges and the insufficient feedback loops. And another way to paraphrase that is saying that there needs to be more communication between the different stakeholders in fiscal policy and debt management and markets, so that the best decisions can be made. And you cannot make decisions unless you have the information. And there's and I believe Catherine will talk more about it, that there is always some rigidity about updating projections and preparing projections that are different than the ones found in the fiscal budget, but that's incredibly unhelpful. And then there is the lack of information sharing. There is the lack of involvement and knowledge about the process during the formulation of these frameworks. And probably not the least, the budget frameworks need to be upgraded, and I think we'll come into that later in the presentation. Can we move to the next, please? So let me just finish my part. It's essential to the policymakers and the decision makers to grasp these sort of interdependencies among revenue, expenditure, and the financing policies. So this is a very, very relevant webinar and a very timely webinar to shine the light on that. And then there is really a call to action is to improve these coordination mechanisms, particularly in the case of developing economies. So to really make sure that the information is flowing freely, and of course that the quality of the information and the processes is sufficiently strong to really grasp the objectives and meet the objectives of fiscal and debt management policies. And often there is a need for capacity development, not only at the technical level, but also at the policy level. And if I was to make an assessment of those, that the efforts of the IMF in particular have been very focused on the technical level, and with the policy level coming a little bit later, meaning that there is no strong demand for this type of analysis or information. So in that context, the Joint Domestic Resource Mobilization Initiative is really important to raise the visibility of this interdependencies, coordination, and take things forward in a more meaningful way. For the lack of better words, creating more demand for sound analysis in these areas. So that would be my last slide, and it's a great pleasure to hand over to my colleague from the Fiscal Affairs Department, Catherine Beyer.
Thank you very much, Tor. So let me just dive right into the aspects that have to do with the fiscal side, and in particular, the revenue side. There's so many topics that you all have brought up, including expenditure, but let me focus on the medium-term revenue strategy just to make it easier to talk about these issues. So just briefly, I'll talk a bit about what is a medium-term revenue strategy, the approach, including its four components, an example of a medium-term revenue strategy revenue proposal, so a little bit more concrete, and how many countries and which countries are currently undertaking medium-term revenue strategies. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, it's asking me to confirm my speaking language, so let me do that as I go. And I see that mine isn't in English. Here we go. So a medium-term revenue strategy, the idea here is to have a high-level roadmap of the tax system reform. So Tor mentioned the short-term and the medium-term, and the medium-term revenue strategy is the revenue side of that reform of the tax system and administration and the legal framework over 4 to 6 years. And the idea is for the government to express this strategy in a clear way with a view to mobilizing its own resources to finance its spending needs. And also with a view to, of course, having the appropriate incentives for economic and social development. So looking at both sides of the coin, not only revenue needs, but how is government going to raise these revenues and what is the impact going to be on the economy and the society? Next slide, please. So this is a very busy slide, but perhaps the most important of this part of the presentation, because it conveys what is a medium-term revenue strategy and what makes it different from what we have done before and what countries have done before in a way. Of course, what we're working to is to improve the quality of the tax systems, including in the context of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And, resource mobilization is actually one of those goals. And others have to do with a huge need for spending to achieve developing countries' development needs and goals. So the idea is to break with a focus on short-term measures, which many countries tend to do, next year, and that's it, and commit to a more comprehensive reform of the tax system that will yield revenues over a longer time frame. It also helps the government raise the profile of this issue of tax system reform and increases the government's accountability in the sense that their revenues being raised for certain spending objectives, and making that link, also as Tor has highlighted in his part of the presentation, is very, very important. So linking revenue to spending and financing needs. It also helps provide, even in this, or I would say especially in this context of volatility and many macroeconomic challenges and social challenges, an increased certainty of revenue, a clearer picture of the likely revenue in the medium term, so over 4 to 6 years. It also helps involve all of the government agencies and entities, academics, civil society, private sector in the mobilization of these resources that are needed. And again, this is one of the most important aspects of revenue raising in all countries, not only developing countries, but we see the challenges that all governments face in addressing all the stakeholders and meeting their needs in raising additional revenue, in shaping the tax system along the lines of what each country requires. So involving all of government, civil society, the private sector, the academic sector is very important. It's also important because building tax capacity, and there I refer to the amount of revenue that a country can raise compared to its potential. This requires a protracted and a persistent effort. Raising revenues does not happen overnight. It takes a long time, and it's very good to have a medium-term plan to work toward that objective. Having a plan also helps government decide the sequencing and the integration of revenue reforms. Is the government going to focus on consumption taxes or income-based taxes? Are objectives going to be to broaden the base or to make the system more progressive? And how do we square or coordinate those reforms? And of course, having a plan always helps the coordination of those who are supporting such plans, whether these be in private sector work or donors and partners. And it can be a combination of both. So let's go to the next slide, please. So these slides are a little bit repeating what these points are, so I'll go over them very, very quickly. So the core elements of a medium-term revenue strategy are having a broad consensus on the level of revenue mobilization effort for the medium term, that is 4 to 6 years, a comprehensive tax system reform plan, reflecting the country's circumstances, the state of the Tax and Customs Administration's capacity, and the tax reform efforts that are already underway. This is really important. This is not a new strategy, but it's building on existing government programs. And one important comment I wanted to make is that medium-term revenue strategy focuses on those main taxes of the tax system. It does not refer to fees, and it does not refer to revenues from extractive industries. These are non-oil and gas revenues or non-mineral revenues. These are the revenues that are raised from the non-extractive industry part of the economy. And of course, a core element is that the country wants to implement such a strategy, that it is interested in designing it, securing the political support for it, and the resources to implement it. So it's a complex undertaking. And it's a framework for coordinated financing of capacity development and delivery of capacity development. Next slide, please. So this is just a nice graphic that talks about the 4 interdependent components of a medium-term revenue strategy. I never know which one to start with because they're all very important, but let's take the green because it goes straight to the core of the medium-term revenue strategy: comprehensive tax system reform and coordinated capacity development. Of course, sustained political commitment. The blue is probably the most important one, and then having set revenue and other goals. Next slide, please. So just a very quick review of the steps that are needed that a country needs to undertake to design and implement a medium-term revenue strategy. Of course, understanding what that approach is important, taking stock of ongoing efforts, as I mentioned before, and then seeing what the difference is or the distance between what we want to achieve and what we have in terms of ongoing reform efforts, and addressing these gaps by formulating a medium-term revenue strategy. Next slide, please. It needs to be a country-led effort. IMF, World Bank, others, we're all here to help. But the most important thing is that this is a country's program and the country wants to achieve this. It really helps to have a single document setting forth the country's vision of the tax system, having a whole of government approach, as I mentioned, and to make it clear that this plan supports a country's development objectives. Next slide, please. This picture comes from missions we did in Rwanda to design a medium-term revenue strategy. So building consensus around a revenue target is really important. As I mentioned, it needs to be inclusive, and it's very interesting to see this process of making tax system reform more inclusive. It should reflect society's expectations on public services, including expenditure needs in the SDG agenda, and it should express the country's social and economic development vision. Here, just on the right-hand side, is a summary chart of how medium-term revenue strategy fits into Rwanda's overall national strategy for transformation. From the beginning, that was the idea that it supported that strategy in a clear way. Next slide, please.
Catherine, may I ask you to conclude in 2 minutes?
I'm about to conclude. I'm about to conclude. Thank you, Bruno. I wanted to show an actual revenue impact of a medium-term revenue strategy in Rwanda. Those are some numbers. This chart just shows the tax policy, tax law, and administration reform. I'm sorry, go back to the table because I thought this was interesting to show the breakdown of what a medium-term revenue strategy looks like. Tax policy reforms of about 0.5% of GDP, and administrative reforms a little bit more of 0.5% of GDP in the medium-term revenue strategy. Next slide just shows the relationship between tax law, tax policy, and administration. It's very important. Medium-term revenue strategy reflect all these 3. Next slide. of course, a framework for coordinating capacity development, which helps align these activities. This is not an easy effort, but it's important and much easier when there is a plan. And next slide, please. Just a list of countries that are currently following the MTRS approach. There are around 20 countries, but that doesn't mean the countries that are not on this list do not have some form of strategy. And next slide. Wrapping it up, I look forward to discussing what some of the challenges are in implementing these, and of course, any other questions the audience may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I had not the opportunity to introduce yourself, and I just repeat that you are Deputy Director in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. And thank you very much for the two speakers from the IMF to have framed the discussion. Et maintenant, si on peut passer
Now we're going to be moving on to our next speakers, and we're going to be looking at those who have been implementing the coordination between the two different strategies. I would like to, without further ado, give the floor to Mr. Habassou Traoré, who is Director of Public Finance and International Taxation for the WAMU Commission. The WAMU Commission, obviously, is a very interesting example of this. Why? Because within the zone you have budgetary rules in order to put in place thresholds for public debts, but you've also got another objective, a common objective with the West African Economic and Monetary Union, so WAMU, and this is exactly what Mr. Traoré will be talking to us about this afternoon. And without further ado, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Bruno. Good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to thank Ferdi. I would like to thank all of the different speakers that have partaken in this webinar. Thank you very much for having invited us to be part of this discussion. It's a very interesting one at that. I am in charge of public finance and tax at the WAMU Commission, and I would like to talk about a couple of lines of thought that we have been looking at. I wanted to talk about two things. I wanted to talk about net debt in the WAMU region, and I also wanted to talk about the different strategies that are in place. For example, the medium-term debt management strategy, MTDS. If we talk about MTDS to start off with, I think that there are a lot of specialists, but for us at WAMU, the current situation shows this table and shows that even if we have different criteria to look at debt, there is between 2013 and 2015, you can see that there was a stabilization of public debts. And then it increased to about 60% of GDP by 2023. If we look at this criteria, we are still in a sticky situation. However, we can see that debt is rising with the risk of over debt coming in, and this over the course of several years. You can see national debt, multilateral debt, bilateral debt, debts linking to Eurobonds, and other debts. This chart shows you the structure of public debt and where financing for each part of this debt is coming from. As I mentioned, national debt or domestic debt is the biggest chunk, and this is then followed by multilateral debt. You also have a couple of countries who have debt in other currencies. But in 2023, we haven't really seen this market that much. We've got public debt, total public debt, about 59%, as I mentioned, in 2023. Now, how do we explain the rising debt levels? And how do we explain the fact that we have a moderate risk of over-indebtedness with a development internal or domestic market? There are several factors that would explain the rise in the WAMI's debt ratio, and they are on the screen. We've got the significant financing needs for socio-economic infrastructure, which means that there are a lack of domestic resources and countries are finding themselves in debt. We can see that this has significant financial impacts. There is also volatility to take into consideration of external factors, which means that states are having to find other forms of financing their endeavors. And with the types of financing conditions that we're seeing, the debt ratio has increased. In our region, obviously, you also know that there is an issue with security. Our states have to increase their military spending with a view of improving the security of our region. And very often, the countries are unable to finance them themselves and then find themselves in debt. However, we can say that despite all of the different factors that I've just mentioned to you, the risk of being over-indebted is relatively moderate. And this is well within the range that has been set by WAMU. We have a couple of comparables on the screen. So you can see once again that there is a rising level of debt, but that the Union's public debt services, both interest and amortization, remain on average below 10% of export earnings compared with 15% in the CMEX zone and 30% in SADC. Therefore, virtually all the countries in the Union are considered to be at moderate risk of debt distress. So if we then move on to how could we optimize the state of play, what is the strategy that we could implement in order to optimize tax revenue mobilization? And would this allow us to have a community of favorable tax policies within the community? I would like to talk about a couple of indicators that are linked to the tax rate pressure rate in the region. You can see in 2022, you've got pressure going from 8.7%, that's for Guinea-Bissau, and it goes right up until 17.9% for Burkina Faso, that's in 2023, with an average of 13.7 for the WAMU region in 2022 and 14.3 in 2023. And you can see with such a high level of stress, there is weakness. And I would like to remind you that the rate that was set requires that there be a minimum level of 20% for tax revenue mobilization. Therefore, we're a little far off the target that has been set. 14.8% is the forecast for 2024, with a high of 19.5 in Burkina Faso and both Senegal, and about 14 or 15 8% in some of the other countries, which once again indicates that we're 5 points off the 20% target for the region. Once again, what could we do to optimize tax revenue mobilization? Over the course of the past few years, we have looked at harmonizing different measures that have been taken. However, this year we are looking at optimizing tax collection or tax revenue. Harmonize because the different tax administrations have recognized that productivity is really under the expectations. Therefore, there was a decision that was adopted in 2024 by WAMU to adopt a regional action plan in order to optimize tax collection with flagship measures. There are countries who have already adopted this approach, 4 million medium-term debt management strategy rather, and by 2025, 2026, everyone would have rolled out their own strategy. This would be based on the different initiatives that were mentioned earlier. However, in order to do so, we should look at more generalized VAT on all consumption, as well as effective taxation of income from securities, everything looking at rationalization of tax expenditure, and so on and so forth. You've also got property. There are lots of products linked to that are not taxed properly in the region. For example, when it comes to securities, this was actually mentioned in the information note that was provided. These are different things that fall outside of the system, and this is problematic. And this is why the strategy looks at the different indicators. We also need to look at rationalizing tax expenditure, as well as combating tax competition, which is also linked to tax expenditure. The two go together, so it's about combating tax competition between WAMU member states. This will allow us to respect budgets. We also have the digitalization of tax procedures. Optimizing tax collection would come with this. This is something that was also part of the WAMU decision. And if we look at increasing productivity of financial administration staff, we want to introduce performance contracts within departments. We also need to promote integrity of agents with effective repression of corruption, as well as the promotion of fiscal civic mindedness. This will only be able to be possible if we have general consent. We therefore need to work with the development of user services, as well as certification of procedures within the administration staff. Mr. Traore says to speaker. This is defined by the different national solutions. You can also see that the strategy was adopted by Benin for the period of 2024-2028. I already mentioned Senegal, the government, civil society, and also non-governmental organizations will need to also be looking at the mobilization of tax revenue. This is a consensual and inclusive approach. We think that this approach is very important in order to optimize tax collection. All of the different WAMU countries have been looking at this. They all have national development plans for MTRS, which requires a lot of financing for these different plans, up to at least 60% of domestic tax. And this maybe could be the channel rather that could be used in order to finance these different. Mr. Traore, can I please ask you to conclude? Yes, absolutely. We can end on this slide. We think it is important that that MTDS and MTRS work together. This would allow to consolidate the budgets and also have a hand over the number of risks that are linked to being in debt. Within WAMU, we are calling within fiscal policy for there to be the rationalization of different spending, the fight against fraud, tax fraud. We know that this is an issue. The international tax fraud linked to transfer pricing, the fight against profit or the base erosion of profit sharing, so the BEPS project put forward by the OECD, as well as different measures taken from a governance point of view, as well as different measures in order to facilitate tax collection and, for example, procedures that are available online, thus allowing the different countries to be able to collect the right amounts of taxes. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Mr. Traore, for this presentation that was very, very interesting. Without further ado, let's move on to our next speaker, Mr. Judikael Agore, who is the Director of Debt at the Congolese. Sorry, if I may jump in here. Mr. Traore needs to, there we go. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Judikael Agore, we know that Congo finds itself in a very different situation through the other WAMU countries. Why? Because they are they have a very low rate of pressure. They have lots of oil available to them. Mr. Oguere has already looked at this, and actually there are already questions for him in the chat. How do you deal with this volatility with regards to the revenue collected from the oil industry? And this is enough. There are other factors that make things complicated. For example, the local market is developing, but it's still quite a narrow market. Therefore, this issue is something that is of paramount importance for Congo, and we're therefore looking forward to hearing your points of view and the practice that you have implemented for this subject. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having invited us to take part in this webinar. I'm maybe going to ask Fabien if she will to share my presentation. At the end of December in 2023, end of 2023, December, we know that the total stock of public debt of 8.5 billion, representing 83.71% of GDP, compared with 8.149 billion the year before. This stock is made up of outstanding debt of 6.973 billion CFA and arrears of 1.54 billion. The debt ratio at 83.7% fell to 68.5 and would fall to 68.5 if any outstanding debt, excluding arrears, is considered. The difference gives an important indication of the weight of arrears in the portfolio. These arrears represent 15.1% of GDP and can be broken down into 1.243 billion for domestic debt and 299 billion in foreign debt. If we can go into the next slide, please. In December, rather of September 2023, the government decided to launch a decree setting out the terms and conditions for repayment of the state's domestic, commercial, and social arrears. It should be noted that this regulatory text offers creditors several options for handling their claims, depending on the category to which they belong. Through this decree, the state defined the terms and conditions for repayment of commercial and social arrears for the period from 2003 to 2021. We had different independent audits during this period by Ernst and Young, amongst other. We're going to be talking now about the different strategies, so MTDS. We are going to look at the different regulations that were adopted. With the different requirements, we've got the obligation for member states to have both debt management systems. But what is the orientation here that is taken? Maybe we can go to the next slide. According to these regulations, borrowing strategy is defined as all decisions taken to implement the borrowing policy, debt policy. Thus, the debt management strategy should be understood as a plan for recourse to the various domestic and external debt instruments, which make it possible to cover the state's financing needs so as to bring down and maintain cost and risk indicators. The public debt management strategy set out covers the multi-annual period 2023-2025 and is annexed to the Finance Act, which is being examined by the Parliament. This requirement, referred to as above, is also part of organic law that is linked to the financial laws. And we also say here that a complete and detailed statement of the forecast debt at the end of the financial year together with debt strategy must be annexed. If we now move on to the second part, the MTRS was presented for the first time in July 2016 at the G20 meetings in China. We can see that it is a social contract on the level of medium-term revenue mobilization that the country is prepared to bear in return for identified public spending, whose impact on wealth redistribution, the fight against poverty and exclusion is quantified and easily measurable. We have a comprehensive reform plan for the tax system reflecting the country's situation and its institutional capacities. We have an overhaul of the strategic framework to meet the targets. Next slide, please. This is the speaker. A reform of the tax and customs administrations to administer the strategy correctly, achieve the desired level of tax compliance, and consequently the revenue targets set by the government. A strengthening of the legal and regulatory framework to enable the overhaul of policies and their administration while seeking a balance between the power of tax administrations and the rights of taxpayers. This has already been mentioned, I believe, by my previous speaker, but the commitment of the authorities to the regular and sustained implementation of the strategy, in particular through strong political support and the provision of resources, securing external support for capacity building, technical assistance and training to help the country overcome any internal constraints it may face in the process of formulating and effectively implementing this.
Suivante, s'il vous plaît.
Next slide, please. One must highlight that in the CEMAC area, reforms are undergoing, focusing on the taxation system. And the effort to mobilize revenue, as our colleague said, should not be only quantitative, but also qualitative. According to a publication of the World Bank, there are four elements that are more effective ways of increasing tax revenue, such as confidence and showing the efficiency of the public action, encourage simplicity, adopt the digital or digitalize your elements, and find new sources of income. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Okay, thank you for sticking to the time allocated to you. That made my task as a moderator easier. I will now give the floor to Philippe Guyonnet, who who is the Secretary General of the Paris Club and who works for la Direction Générale du Trésor, and he will give you the point of view of a developed country on the importance of having a strategy based on the debt and on tax revenue and how you can optimize this. But as the Secretary General of the Paris Club, he will talk about the case of over-indebted countries and how this is treated in the restructuring of domestic debts. So the floor is yours, Philippe. Thank you very much, Bruno. How much time do we have? If you can stick to the 10 minutes allocated to you so that we have the time to take questions. Sorry for not being such a good timekeeper. Thank you to Ferdi, thank you to the interpreters, and thank you to all the different speakers. I will just speak with a dual hat as someone working for the Treasury and someone who is a Secretary General of the Paris Club, and I will talk about the restructuring of the public debt. I have 3 points, i.e. the importance of a diversified financing strategy when it comes to debts and revenues, the link between the tax strategy and the indebtedness strategy, and 3, the way we in the Paris Club have just looked at the restructuring of domestic debts and the specific stakes. The first point is the need of a global strategy, of an overall strategy, a financing strategy, given the amounts of the debt. Why? Well, Bruno, you said that with the other speakers, but if we take the example of the financing of the climate and energy transition, if we say that we have 2,000 billions to finance every year, it means 6.5% of the GDP of developing countries. But this gives you an idea of the amount. And if you have these amounts that are very high, you will not just finance them with more grants or just the debt. You need to have a combination of the different factors. So what is important is to develop domestic markets to finance the needs. But there are also risks associated to that because this may create a loop between the banks and the government debts. And you may also have domestic markets which are saturated. How do we do that? You have the budget and the financial. The budget, the fiscal link is not maybe easy, but you need a regulatory framework. You need to have an institutional and fiscal framework, and you need human resources that would be adapted with technical competences and skills. And for the financial one, you will have stakes that are a bit wider because we go beyond the borrowing policy. We have the mobilization of domestic credit. You have governance under transparency, data transparency to assess the credit risk. And I believe that Mr. Mali will tell us more about it, the stable framework, and also the framework encouraging private investments. And this goes hand in hand with savings, because for investments, you need domestic savings. So in this first part, as regarding the way you can have an overall financing strategy, what did we see? We saw that the domestic debt has been increased while the level of indebtedness was diminishing up to the 2010, more or less. So the domestic financing was encouraged and by the international community as being a way of limiting the risk of external refinancing and to prevent a debt crisis. So the idea is that the domestic allowed to prevent certain risks. While if you look at the global debt, you realize that the amounts were smaller. And there is really a difference between, in developing countries, between largest economies. There are markets which are quite developed, such as Egypt, Morocco, Nigeria, where we have markets which are highly developed, where the countries can issue in currencies, local currencies, and foreign currencies. And we have countries where it's more complicated because the markets are smaller. So it is positive to have a local market which is has developed and that favors finance the development policies of the country. But what is at stake is also being able to finance not just the state, but if the financing of the state weighs too much on private investment, this is something you have to take into account. So the first point was how we have this global strategy, and secondly, what is the link between the strategies? I will just focus a little bit more on the detail of the management of the debt, as we can see that for the sovereign markets. 2 points. The first thing is that you have in the medium term, you have to foresee for the medium term and manage in the short term. And you need to have a methodic approach of the market. So the first point, foresee in the medium term and manage for the short term. First of all, you have to foresee the needs for the period of 1 year, and then you have to manage during the year. And just one word about the treasury. Cash, foreseeing our needs for the period of 1 year, you have to ask yourself how much you need to refinance yourself or to invest in the medium term or long term, as Mr. Traoré mentioned. And the short term is just to deal with the hazards. And this gives me an annual financing need, which is the principle to pay back and the deficit to refinance, to finance. And we need a link between the budget unit or the tax unit and the debt service unit. In other words, you have to identify the tax revenue and identify the amount. It has to be adjusted during the year rather than having forecasts that are not real, because otherwise this will have an impact on our cash profile. And we have also a macroeconomic situation, and we have just to deal with the shocks by issuing short-term securities. The use of treasury, this allows to reduce the indebtedness, because any euro taken from the treasury account is €1 less, which allows us to reduce the indebtedness. Sometimes you have countries saying, I would like to have this IT tool, but the IT tool is just a mirror of the procedures existing and underlying this. So you need to have accounting procedures which are linked to what you do and have a good visibility on the treasury account. There are countries where treasury people have no access to do the continuous amount of what you have in the treasury. And the second point is the methodical approach of the market. And I would say that to be brief, we need to have a regular approach of the market without any opportunism. If you publish a calendar of the schedule of the short term, the medium term, and you always have the same rate, you're present all along the curve. We talked about lengthening the maturities. This is not always possible because you need a certain flexibility and you have to meet the needs of the investors. If you have markets where pensions are private, it's easier to issue for 20 years, while it is not always easy on markets where pensions come from social funds. And the third point is the rise of the domestic debt and the Paris Club experience. The first thing is that countries, when there is a problem on the stock and the flow, for external debt, when you have a problem with the debt, countries prefer to restructure the external debt rather than restructuring the external and the domestic debt, which is the case of Ghana. And it is really a decision made by the country. You don't compare the effort made for the external and the domestic debt. There are costs which have to be taken into account by the government, because this has an impact on the credibility, on the assets of the domestic agents, on the stability of the financial sector. And it's really a political decision, but the government committing itself needs to have a very clear and specific communication regarding the strategy. The clearer there's a communication, the more convincing it will be for investors, and the more accepted it will be. And I will just conclude by saying that we can have better compensations, and these are things that you have to take into account, because voters are also those who save money. So in other words, how can we have a link between the financing strategy and the mobilization of revenues? This is what is important. I give you the floor, Bruno. Thank you very much, Philippe. And as we say in good French, last but not least, I will give the floor to Mr. Aurélien Mali, who is the Vice President of the rating agency Moody's. They are the ones who assess the indebtedness strategies and also the mobilization of tax revenues and the quality of the interaction between both. And the floor is yours, Mr. Mali. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you and to all the participants. I was very happy when the FERDI contacted us to attend this session, because I believe that it's an interesting topic. As a rating agency, we cannot give any piece of advice. So I would just restrict myself well, not saying you have to or the countries should, but I can talk about what is done right now. We can talk about the context. You can also talk about what countries try to set out, or the trend that exists in the countries we rate. We rate 28 countries in Africa and 148 countries globally. And during the last 15 years, I was focused on the African continent. And since this conference talks about most of more fragile countries, if I may say so, there is a list of 77 countries identified by the World Bank and the IMF. And before I enter into the details, I just wanted to talk about the context, which is ours right now. After many different shocks, be it the shocks related to COVID or the energy shocks and the increase in food prices, we have economies that are fragile and which try to reduce the deficits linked to these different shocks. And this leads me to talk about two major elements before I continue. The first one being that the level of the debt in Africa, or the debt in Africa, is at a level which corresponds to what they had at the beginning of the years 2000, after all the strategies to reduce the debt, because there were countries that were over-indebted, and there were the defaults in Zambia, Niger, Ethiopia, Mali, because of sanctions. But we had technical defaults. But it is important to highlight the fact that the debt implies a certain rigidity in public expenditures, because the interest of the debt regarding the income was multiplied by 3. And what I say for the continent is also true for the other countries on this list. 15 years ago, the interest rate was about 4% for the income. Now we're closer to 14%. Therefore, the pressure on the expenditures, budgetary expenditures, is really high. You had the protection of the most vulnerable, the unemployment of young people, the need for basic infrastructures such as schools and hospitals, and also other infrastructures to support the economic development on energy and logistics. And the needs, as mentioned by Philippe, to develop protections against climate risks and physical risk, explains why reducing expenses and ensure the sustainability of the debt are very difficult to implement. And of course, the strategy, which is the most obvious given the delay, or the fact that some countries, that the emerging countries have a level of income which is of 25%, it really leads us to point to the increasing the income of governments. And this is something we see in all the fund programs which have been developed recently. And we really focus on the development and the increase of incomes rather than reducing expenses and expenditures, which may have a negative impact on the growth countries' need to be able to develop.
Within this context, I think it's very important, and we can also see the strategy, the mobilization strategy through debt that is implemented. This is very high level of debt, so we already have constraints because the structure is a lot more complicated than maybe 15 or 20 years ago. And then in addition to this, we have other elements, which means that it's a lot more difficult as it currently stands to and also look at the strategy. When we're looking at the strategy here, what we can see is that it's extremely difficult. You saw the presentation that was given by Mr. Traoré or even Mr. Giscaël. The level of revenue is quite low, and it's about 25% of GDP for some of these countries. And the current level in the Wama region is about 15%. It's really, really low. There is a concentration of taxpayers, and that's one of the challenges. How can we increase the tax basis? There are also other success stories that we can look at. For example, the introduction of VAT that was introduced successfully. We've also had very good examples of digitalization that have come out over different years that have actually worked from a revenue point of view. However, this is still difficult. It's not that revenue is not increasing per se, it's that as we've got nominal growth, we also need there to be even more growth on the other side for this to have an impact. Therefore, as has already been mentioned in Catherine's presentation, we need there to be persistence. I've been working with governments for 20 years now, and there isn't one that said, we've got a strategy, we're going to increase this. But even though they've got that will, the works don't always bear their fruits as quickly as they need to be. Now, if we think about the resources for debt mobilization, here we've got a little bit more to say. We can talk about domestic debt. The region is characterized with revenue per capita that is quite low. We can also see that these saving rates or also the capacity to save. We know that in sub-Saharan Africa, 80% of the savings are in the south of South Africa rather. We can also see that the development of institutional investors is different. The capital markets not that deep, and it's very difficult for long-term loans to be financed. The needs of the government means that there is this a wave of eviction created for the other borrowers. Capital is not easily available. We have two examples of this in the Wame region, but also in the CIMAC region. It is with the money of the central bank that is coming here. And this situation doesn't mean that central banks can provide without a limit. They have limits, they have thresholds to what they can do. And we can feel this as well in the way that they're communicating to the countries. They're saying that you need to have consolidated budgets. You need to look about the deficits. We cannot keep on dealing with liquidity deficits. And then the second element that I can maybe mention to you for the domestic market is the will or the stability and macroeconomic stability. We have raw materials that are very important. There is inflation that is very important. Therefore, we also have a refusal coming from country to emit further debts because they think that the costs are just far too high. That's very important to mention this. So a couple of words on the external markets. I think that this is important. The first thing is that we have international investors, and they actually don't need that much sway to then go and invest elsewhere. The risk premium for Africa is thought to be too high, and this even by Africans themselves, and investors will base themselves on very simple criteria. Our role as an agency, there are success stories. For example, Cote d'Ivoire is a success story, and Brazil is one as well. It is to increase transparency, but also visibility on what is being done. and the opinion that's given by third parties. We've also got a capacity of a country to pay off their debt. Now we also have other elements if we were to look at the solidity of institutions, governance, which are important elements. There is a lot that needs to be done for the availability of data. If we were to take into consideration the last 5 years where debt has been a lot higher than thought, there are risks that need to be taken into consideration with the coup d'etat that we've seen and other instability for midterm policies. Therefore, this credibility that in order to receive, to implement what has been decreed is important. Why? Because we can see credit notation looks at midterm. The borrower also has an obligation now, but they'll be paid in the future. Therefore, we need to have an idea of what's going to happen in the future. What we do see currently, and I'm not going to mention another important element, but that is linked to how we manage our stock. If this is not done clearly, an investor can find themselves a prisoner to what they're doing. This can also limit their capacity to invest in the country. We can see two trends that are very important. For multilateral banks rather, and also the World Bank, this is very important. There is a real, I would say, a real will from the G20 countries for bilateral banks to be able to do a little bit more with what they've got. And this also translates by an increase in financing. We see projects that have been implemented in order to hone in on this element. This is important because we're looking at concessional financing. The second thing that we can see is that obviously there is a risk of external liquidity that is higher currently. Why? Because the risk premium is higher for Africa than for Latin America. For Euro bonds that were emitted when the interest rates were lower than they currently are now. However, now we see lots of bonds that have come to Euro bonds that have come to maturity. We're also seeing that for several countries, the Kenya, for example, it's about 11%, or was it 11% a couple of months ago? And they were able to refinance their bonds. These are very important or high costs. You've got other costs as well. There is this idea of costs that need to be taken into consideration by the countries when they're trying to find alternative financing. But these debts are coming up to maturity, and therefore we need to find a way to finance them. I'm going to stop here. I know that there are lots of other things to say, but I'm trying to respect the time constraints. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having respect for taking the floor, and also for answering a certain number of questions that they already are in the chat, given the time constraints and the fact that we are allowed to continue just a little bit longer. And if they do agree, maybe we can have a final intervention just to react to what has been heard from the other panelists. And maybe we can also respond to the different questions that have been asked in the chat. There is a first question that is for Mr. Aquari, but also to the IMF, and this is linked to the difficulty of the implementation of these strategies, especially when we think about the volatility of oil products and royalties that need to be paid. We have a second subject as well. This is linked to investors or foreign direct investment with the fact that if we want financing for development through these different channels, should we be allowing for tax exonerations or exemptions? And how does this also have an impact on the mobilization of tax resources? There is important arbitration that needs to be done here. There is a third group of questions, and this is on Mercy for WAMU and the monetary unions or the economic unions. And here, what are the different incentives that can be put into place so that the budgetary rules linked to debts and debt limits, but also rules with objectives for the rates of tax pressure that we can have. So this is maybe more for Mr. Traore. And then we have this is the tax burden rather. We also have the different measures linked to mobilizing tax resources. And maybe I can ask everyone to take the floor and to give one tax measure that would be easy, politically speaking, to implement, but also technically speaking. So what would be one tax measure that countries could implement that would be easy both on the political but technical side of things as well to make their lives easier? So if we're going to follow exactly the same order for the speakers, I'm going to ask for just a quick, in a nutshell, do you have a reaction to what you've heard from the other participants? And also, based on these questions that I've just asked, do you have any answers? And thank you very much for accepting to stay on a little bit longer.
Mr. Jonathan?
Yes, sorry.
Mr. Jonathan, would you like to start?
Yeah, so my reaction is really what I see on the debt management strategy in particular. It is really clear from the country presentations the importance of the domestic debt market development, and there I would wish I could offer you what we sometimes call a magic bullet. It just takes time, effort, and consistency, and the key thing here is that countries need to gradually adapt to market realities and market determined interest rates. So this is something that also came through in the presentation from my colleague from the Paris Club. Really, that trying to move the needle on the domestic market and the resource mobilization, and there we have like a number of lessons from countries that have made tremendous progress on developing their local markets, and maybe Ferdi could help us with the sharing of these experiences and documents. Thank you.
Catherine?
Hello. Delighted to make a couple of comments, Bruno. I first find it so interesting, and thank you for bringing these topics together, right, at different levels. I think that just having this dialogue is really interesting and useful. I agree with Tor that unfortunately there are no magic bullets, but if you were to ask me from a tax policy point of view, what a very important reform is to work toward is broadening the tax base. We wrote a paper last year called Building Tax Capacity in Developing Countries. And if you look at the tax policy section, number one recommendation is to broaden the tax base. Now, that's politically not always so easy, but there are inevitably measures that governments can take to move slowly and gradually to broadening the tax base. So that's one thing I would highlight. The other is to invest in the tax and customs administrations. We often see that there's not enough investment, both not only in financial terms, but in strengthening the managerial the managerial cadres of the revenue administrations. And this can make a big difference in setting forth a strategy and implementing it, which, as everyone, I think, in this webinar has agreed, takes time and persistence. So those are two things that I think are very important. Broadening the tax base and making sure government invests in strengthening the revenue administrations and keeping them professional and not subject to the political winds. These are two really important aspects. And I'd like to just, if you look at the countries that Mr. Traoré mentioned from the WIMU, that if a country invests in its administration, digitalization is part of it, but it's not the only aspect, that we can see real progress. And I think Senegal has made good progress. I'm looking forward to seeing what Côte d'Ivoire will do in the coming years. And of course, Benin has also adopted in the way of adopting a medium-term revenue strategy. So these are all good examples in the region, and I think countries can to look to those that have been more successful, have had success in implementing their strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. C'était très intéressant de voir la priorité que vous avez mise sur
It was very interesting to see what you spoke about. So how do you widen the tax base? And I understand that implicitly that answers the question when you've got tax policy that can be used to develop or to encourage new financing with perhaps exemptions for FDIs, for other types of investments as well in domestic public debt. And when you have this, the advice coming from taxpayers is to privilege widening the tax base. Thank you very much. Mr. Traoré, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Yes. I think I would agree with increasing or widening the tax base. This would be, for me, a starting point. And it's about how you do this. Either you do this with new things that can be taxed, and we also look at having tax bases that we can use. But in order to answer the question, what measures can be implemented, I can also see digitalization. However, the question when it comes to foreign direct investment, what can we do to attract this foreign direct investment? I think that this is a very interesting question. I think that we need to rationalize these investments, and also we can look at what is necessary and those that can be controlled and monitored. The jury is still out on this one. I think it will be difficult to, but we can't have an open bar either. We can't just give everyone these tax incentives because this would have an impact on public spending. Therefore, we need to look at this. If we think about the tax burden as well, the tax burden has always been a question. We are 5 points off our target. And I think that we're 10 points off what Mr. Mali said. 25% of the GDP was the figure given by Mali. We are not far from destination, but we've still got work left to be done. But we can see that countries such as Senegal are on the right track. We're waiting for Côte d'Ivoire and Benin now, who are also going to be following suit. And the idea is not to break everything apart and to backpedal now, but to continue with this progress. Thank you.
La question qui a été posée aussi sur.
So the question that was put on the specific case of countries with a lot of oil public oil revenue and suffering from the volatility of these revenues, is there any specific way of managing them? Well, thank you very much, Mr. Gabriel, and thank you for your question. Actually, we came a bit late. The experience may be a source of inspiration for many African countries, and they could take as a source of inspiration the Finland policy, i.e. Norway. Norway was a very good example for raw materials such as oil. As to the widening of the tax base, those who spoke before would agree in saying that it must come with a good communication. If communication is not made, if you don't communicate with the people, they might not be willing to accept the reform. So if upstream you had good communication and if you explain the measure properly, I believe the situation can be easier. Thank you. Thank you very much. Philippe, maybe one or two comments to close this session before Mr. Mali. Yeah, thank you, Bruno. I had noted more or less the same thing as my colleagues. I believe there is a combination of factors. There's not just one solution, but it's a combination of factors. And widening of the tax base, as Mrs. Barr said, is the most obvious to do by reducing the informal sector and offering facilities for taxpayers. With digitalization, it may also the traceability of payments. I believe that everything that has to do with widening tax base is a good thing. I believe that the rates, it's better to have a small rate for a wider tax base. And I think it was Mr. Traoré who said that in the reforms, what is important is, as we have for WEMU, a target or targets and a strategy. But progressively, you should tell the people where you're moving towards. As to the oil revenues, you have a lot of countries who manage the revenue, oil revenue, with a specific target in mind. If these revenues are just meant to finance investments and not the current expenditures of financing needs, this avoids a chaotic tax policy to finance the current financing plan of the government. I believe that there are certain reasons for that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Mali, up to you to conclude. And I feel like asking me or putting a question to you just to conclude. For you, might be a bit intrusive for the rating agencies, but for you, the sustainability level of the debt, is it higher for a country with a reliable tax revenues mobilization? Well, as you know, we cannot give cannot advise you. So I will just answer your question immediately by saying that what we see is that the countries who had an advanced management of the debt were able to better resist the shocks that we have had over the last few years. One example, which is well known, but this is also true for Benin, but the Côte d'Ivoire refinanced a large number of the maturities and which were coming to an end, and pushed the maturities which were supposed to be repaid in 2025, 2026, and they pushed that back to 2032. So they don't have any maturities to pay on the market before 2032. This is a strategy they implemented even before the COVID crisis. So they managed this period by financing their deficit in quite an easy way, because they did not have this pressure of large Eurobond to be repaid. And through borrowings from the partners, they were able to refinance their deficit. So this activity, which is a strategy, there is an underlying strategy to borrow in euros and to also be aware of the fact that the management of the debt profile was something important, because you have to be very proactive by anticipating shocks. And this happened to be the right strategy for the country. So I would say that strategies sometimes might not be efficient, but they allow to cover certain risks. Having a strategy allows to cover certain risks, in my humble opinion. And I just would like to conclude by saying that even if it seems complicated, I believe that the continent and the different countries will make it. We have seen an improvement in the GDP per capita in some countries. And as highlighted, there is a willingness to make it and to set up with international organizations such as the IMF a strategy to increase incomes. For the debt, it seems a bit more complicated because of the present level of debt and because of the present creditors. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for concluding with such a positive note, and thank you to all the participants to the webinars, and sorry for extending this meeting by 15 minutes, but I believe that the discussion was worth it, and I wish you all a nice afternoon, particularly to those of you in the United States.